Hi, I'm Linda from English Learning Mind Map. Today, we will learn about Princess Diana. Princess Diana. Observers often say that Princess Diana managed to redefine the meaning of modern royalty and humanize an institution long associated with distance, ceremonial reserve, and inherited authority. Her story does not unfold as a simple tale of glamour or tragedy, but as a gradual transformation in which private sensitivity, public suffering, and moral courage combined to alter how millions understood the monarchy itself. Princess Diana is the root of this narrative because the entire structure of her life radiates outward from her singular presence, a young aristocratic woman who became, through immense pressure and unusual empathy, one of the most recognizable and emotionally powerful figures of the 20th century. The noun Princess Diana refers not only to the Princess of Wales as a historical person, but also to the wider cultural narrative attached to her name, image, and memory. To redefine suggests changing the accepted meaning of something so deeply that old assumptions no longer seem sufficient, and Diana did exactly that by making royal visibility emotionally charged rather than merely ceremonial. To humanize goes a step further, indicating the act of making something appear more relatable, vulnerable, and recognizably human, and through touch, candor, and compassion, she made the royal role seem less remote than it had for generations. Because Princess Diana stands above every other node, this opening must lead downward into aristocratic origins, where the emotional contradictions of her future life first began to take shape beneath the polished surface of noble privilege. Aristocratic origins. Beneath Princess Diana, aristocratic origins helps originate and mold the conditions that shaped her before she ever entered palaces, tabloid headlines, or humanitarian campaigns. Because her later visibility only makes full sense when placed against the older world from which she emerged. She was born not into ordinariness, but into a social order weighted with hierarchy, ancestry, etiquette, and expectation, and yet that privileged environment also contained instability, loneliness, and emotional fracture. Aristocratic Origins names this foundational sphere: the noble background, domestic culture, inherited status, and early emotional climate that surrounded Diana in childhood. To originate is to arise from a particular source, and Diana's later poise, sensitivity, and conflicted relationship with public duty all originated in a household shaped by both formality and personal vulnerability. To mold suggests gradual formation through repeated influence rather than sudden instruction, and her instincts were molded by a world that taught decorum outwardly while often leaving emotional needs insufficiently protected inwardly. This node sits directly under Princess Diana because it explains the first layer beneath the public myth. Before she became a symbol, she was a child of rank, custom, and fracture. The contrast is crucial. Her later ability to connect with ordinary people becomes more striking when one sees how elevated her starting point was, and her discomfort within rigid structures becomes easier to understand when one recognizes how early she learned that prestige does not guarantee security. From aristocratic origins, the story moves naturally into Spencer heritage because lineage itself provided the more specific family identity through which her early world was interpreted. Spencer heritage. Within aristocratic origins, Spencer heritage allows us to inherit and embody the deeper historical legacy that surrounded Princess Diana long before the wider public began projecting meaning onto her face, voice, and gestures. She did not emerge from anonymity, but from a family whose name already carried political memory, landed prestige, and centuries of proximity to national history. Spencer heritage refers to the ancestral identity of the Spencer family, the noble tradition into which Diana was born, and the symbolic burden attached to belonging to such a house. To inherit means receiving something transmitted from those who came before, whether property, title, values, or intangible expectation, and Diana inherited a name that already implied status, scrutiny, and continuity. To embody means making an abstract legacy visible in one's own person, and even as a young woman, she came to embody aspects of Spencer heritage simply by carrying its name, appearance, manners, and social position into a new historical moment. This node follows aristocratic origins because the broad category of aristocratic life becomes more concrete once it is attached to a particular lineage rather than a general class. Spencer heritage narrows the frame from noble background in general to family identity in particular, showing how Diana's life was shaped not only by aristocracy as a system, but by the specific symbolic inheritance of the Spencers. That inheritance gave her both legitimacy and burden. It placed her within continuity, yet it also meant that her personal life would rarely remain purely personal. From Spencer heritage, the narrative proceeds into Althorp Estate because lineage is not only carried in names and titles, but also lived within places whose walls preserve memory, hierarchy, and emotional association. Althorp Estate. Emerging from Spencer heritage, Althorp Estate shows how Princess Diana came to inhabit and cherish a physical setting that concentrated family memory, noble symbolism, and intimate childhood feeling into one emotionally charged environment. The family line was not merely an abstraction recorded in titles and genealogies. It existed materially in rooms, corridors, landscapes, portraits, and habits of life that surrounded her formative years. Althorp Estate refers to the Spencer family seat, the ancestral home that represented continuity, social standing, and inherited identity while also serving as the backdrop for Diana's inner development. To inhabit means living within a place so that its atmosphere becomes part of one's emotional and psychological world, and Diana inhabited Althorp not simply as a resident, but as a child shaped by its vastness, traditions, and silences. To cherish implies holding something with deep affection or treasured attachment, and despite the complexities of her upbringing, Althorp remained associated with memory, belonging, and a sense of rootedness that endured across the turbulence of later life. This node grows directly from Spencer heritage because family legacy becomes fully tangible when it is anchored in a place where that legacy is repeatedly seen and felt. Althorp Estate translated ancestry into daily experience. It offered grandeur, certainly, but it also exposed the paradox of a privileged setting that could still contain emotional isolation. That contradiction matters, because Diana's later sensitivity to loneliness, displacement, and hidden pain did not emerge in spite of noble life alone, but partly within it. Moving upward from Althorp Estate through Spencer heritage to aristocratic origins, the story then turns into early schooling, where the private environment of home gives way to the social and developmental world in which her character began to interact with others more independently. Early schooling. Moving upward from the familial world of Althorp Estate through Spencer heritage to aristocratic origins, early schooling reveals how Princess Diana began to cultivate social instinct and navigate the ordinary demands of growth within institutions less grand than her lineage, yet equally formative for her temperament. Schooling did not make her famous, nor did it turn her into a polished intellectual celebrity, but it exposed traits that later became central to her public role: warmth, empathy, awkwardness, self-consciousness, and a practical rather than abstract intelligence. Early schooling refers to the phase of education and adolescent development in which Diana encountered peers, routines, discipline, and everyday evaluation outside the symbolic intensity of ancestral home life. To cultivate suggests the steady development of qualities through repeated practice and experience, and in these years she cultivated interpersonal awareness, kindness, and a natural attentiveness to emotional atmosphere. To navigate means finding one's way through complexity rather than mastering it effortlessly, and Diana had to navigate expectations, insecurities, and institutional structures that did not always reward the traits that would later make her remarkable. This node follows aristocratic origins because social formation extends beyond family and lineage into how one learns to function among others. Early schooling softens the aristocratic frame by showing Diana not as a title in preparation, but as a young person still discovering where her strengths lay. Her future charisma did not arise from academic brilliance alone. It came partly from feeling uncertain and learning how to connect despite that uncertainty. From early schooling, the narrative moves naturally into Nursery Assistance because her practical tenderness with children offered one of the first clear public signs of the caregiving instinct that would later define much of her appeal. Nursery Assistance. Developing out of early schooling, Nursery Assistance allows Princess Diana to nurture and reassure others in ways that revealed her most instinctive strengths before royal spectacle transformed her life, because here her emotional gifts appeared in everyday, untheatrical form. Long before she became a global humanitarian symbol, she spent time in work that involved direct care, patience, attentiveness, and the calming presence required around small children. Nursery Assistance refers to the pre-royal caregiving role through which Diana worked with children in an ordinary social setting, far removed from palaces and official ceremony. To nurture means supporting growth with gentle, sustained care, and this word fits Diana especially well because her manner often conveyed encouragement through warmth rather than authority. To reassure means easing anxiety or uncertainty by offering comfort and steadiness, and in this environment, she reassured children not by performance, but by natural human presence. This note follows early schooling because it converts the personal traits cultivated in youth into visible action. It shows that Diana's famous empathy was not an invention of public relations once she entered royal life, but a quality already active in modest, practical settings. Nursery Assistance is important precisely because it appears small in scale. The later Princess of Wales, who comforted patients and embraced marginalized people, can be understood more clearly when one sees the young woman who already found meaning in caring for the vulnerable. In that sense, this note acts as a quiet bridge from private formation to public vocation. Moving upward from Nursery Assistance through early schooling and aristocratic origins to Princess Diana, the story then descends into royal transition. Because the world in which she expressed care informally was about to be replaced by an international arena in which every gesture would be observed, interpreted, and magnified. Royal transition. Moving upward from the modest intimacy of Nursery Assistance through early schooling and aristocratic origins to Princess Diana, royal transition marks the moment when Princess Diana had to navigate a radically altered life and transform herself under a level of scrutiny so intense that personal development could no longer remain private. What had once been a largely aristocratic, but still semi-ordinary existence was suddenly absorbed into the machinery of monarchy, spectacle, and global expectation. Royal transition refers to the movement from private noblewoman to public royal figure, a passage that changed not only Diana's circumstances, but the very conditions under which she could feel, speak, and live. To navigate implies steering through a difficult and often unstable environment without full control over its forces, and Diana had to navigate public fascination, institutional protocol, emotional pressure, and the sudden loss of anonymity. To transform indicates deep alteration rather than minor adjustment, and her life was transformed in appearance, duty, symbolism, and personal identity. This node sits directly under Princess Diana as a major new phase that contrasts sharply with the quieter life that preceded it. A woman whose gifts had appeared in local, human-scale settings was thrust into one of the most visible and formal systems in the world. Royal transition is therefore not merely about marriage or title, it is about a total rearrangement of reality. The inner self had to coexist with a newly imposed public role, and the tension between those two dimensions would define much of her life. From royal transition, the narrative first moves into public courtship because the transformation began not after royal entry was complete, but during the globally watched romantic spectacle that introduced Diana to the world as a future princess. Public courtship. Within royal transition, public courtship shows how Princess Diana began to captivate the world even as she had to withstand attention that was already becoming intrusive. Because the romance that elevated her into public imagination also exposed her to forces she could not yet fully manage. The relationship was never simply private affection unfolding at its own pace. From an early stage, it became a spectacle onto which newspapers, photographers, commentators, and the public projected fantasy, hope, and judgment. Public courtship refers to the highly visible romance that preceded Diana's royal marriage and made her, almost overnight, one of the most watched women in the world. To captivate means drawing attention so powerfully that observers become emotionally or imaginatively absorbed, and Diana captivated audiences through youth, beauty, reserve, and a palpable air of vulnerability that made her appear both glamorous and approachable. To withstand means enduring a force without collapsing under it, and she had to withstand intense fascination, speculative narratives, and invasive curiosity before she had fully developed the resources to resist them. This note follows royal transition because it captures the earliest public phase of that broader transformation. Before formal integration into royal duty came the romantic drama that turned an individual into a symbol. Public courtship is essential because it reveals how quickly tenderness and intrusion became intertwined in her life. The same attention that elevated her also began to consume her. From public courtship, the story narrows into media frenzy, where generalized fascination hardened into systematic pursuit and scrutiny. Media frenzy. Growing directly out of public courtship, media frenzy demonstrates how the fascination surrounding Princess Diana escalated into an environment that could scrutinize and pursue her with extraordinary persistence, converting curiosity into surveillance and admiration into pressure. What began as excited observation soon became a commercial and cultural machine in which every gesture, outfit, expression, and rumor could be amplified, monetized, and reinterpreted. Media frenzy refers to the invasive press atmosphere that followed Diana through public engagements and private moments alike, making visibility a condition she could rarely escape. To scrutinize means examining something with close, often unforgiving attention, and the media scrutinized Diana's body language, emotions, relationships, parenting, and clothing as if each detail carried national significance. To pursue implies chasing persistently, and photographers literally pursued her movement through streets, holidays, and transitional spaces, while narratives about her pursued her reputation in print and broadcast. This note follows public courtship because romance alone did not fully explain the intensity of exposure. The media system amplified it into an almost permanent condition. Media frenzy turned public life into something nearly inescapable, and this shaped Diana's self-presentation, anxieties, and strategic choices in profound ways. She learned to use visibility, but she also suffered under it. That duality matters because later humanitarian effectiveness and emotional openness cannot be separated from the press world that both magnified her voice and destabilized her peace. Moving upward from media frenzy through public courtship to royal transition, the narrative then turns into monarchic integration, because beyond tabloids and cameras, Diana also faced the inward challenge of adjusting to the monarchy as an institution with its own rules, silences, and demands. Monarchic integration. Moving upward from the externally pressurized world of media frenzy through public courtship to royal transition, monarchic integration reveals how Princess Diana had to assimilate herself into royal structures while also challenging the emotional and symbolic constraints those structures imposed on her. Becoming a princess was not merely a change in wardrobe, title, or residence. It meant entering a system shaped by protocol, hierarchy, restraint, and inherited expectations concerning behavior, silence, and duty. Monarchic integration refers to this process of being absorbed into the institutional life of monarchy, where personal identity must coexist with ceremonial role. To assimilate means entering a system and adjusting oneself to its norms, and Diana was expected to assimilate into traditions older and more rigid than her own emotional instincts. To challenge suggests testing, questioning, or unsettling established arrangements, and whether intentionally or by the force of her personality, she challenged those arrangements by making feeling visible where reserve had long been preferred. This note follows royal transition because public transformation alone is incomplete without internal institutional adjustment. The monarchy did not simply provide Diana with prominence, it also demanded conformity, and the friction between those demands and her temperament helped define her public image. Monarchic integration is therefore a story of tension as much as adaptation. She learned royal duty, but she never became a seamless extension of the institution. From monarchic integration, the narrative moves into protocol adherence because the broad challenge of entering monarchy took daily form in the specific expectations of formal conduct and public performance. Protocol adherence. Emerging from the wider struggle of monarchic integration, protocol adherence shows how Princess Diana was required to observe royal conventions and perform public duty within a highly regulated ceremonial world, even when those forms did not always align with her instinctive emotional style. The monarchy operated not only through abstract tradition, but through concrete behaviors: how to stand, greet, travel, dress, appear, and embody dignity under observation. Protocol adherence refers to the formal system of rules and expectations governing public royal conduct, the disciplined exterior through which legitimacy and continuity were displayed. To observe means following something carefully and attentively, and Diana was expected to observe codes that controlled gesture, sequence, and symbolism. To perform, in this context, does not imply insincerity, but the execution of a visible role before an audience, and she had to perform the duties of a princess in ways that satisfied institutional expectations while still remaining recognizably herself. This node grows naturally from monarchic integration because broad assimilation becomes concrete through repeated acts of compliance. Protocol was where the abstract pressures of monarchy entered the body and schedule of daily life. Yet this is also where Diana's distinctiveness became impossible to suppress. She could observe the rules, but she often infused them with warmth, eye contact, touch, and emotional immediacy that made the performance feel less remote. In that sense, protocol adherence exposes both conformity and divergence at once. Moving upward from protocol adherence through monarchic integration and royal transition to Princess Diana, the story then turns toward humanitarian advocacy. Because one of the most powerful ways Diana reshaped royal performance was by directing it toward suffering, exclusion, and human vulnerability. Humanitarian advocacy. Moving upward from the tensions of protocol adherence through monarchic integration and royal transition to Princess Diana, humanitarian advocacy marks the phase in which Princess Diana began to champion neglected causes and destigmatize forms of suffering that many public figures still approached with caution, discomfort, or distance. Here, the royal platform she had learned to carry was redirected toward moral witness, intimate contact, and public compassion on behalf of people often treated as invisible or untouchable. Humanitarian advocacy refers to Diana's sustained engagement with hospitals, charities, vulnerable communities, and urgent social issues, through which she reoriented public attention toward the marginalized. To champion means supporting a cause with visible energy and conviction, and Diana championed not only specific institutions, but the dignity of individuals whom society often pushed aside. To destigmatize means reducing the shame, fear, or social contamination associated with a condition or group, and her presence helped destigmatize illness, emotional pain, disability, and exclusion by insisting on human contact rather than symbolic distance. This node stands as one of the clearest expressions of how she redefined royal significance. She turned official visibility into compassionate presence. Instead of allowing monarchy to remain solely ceremonial, she made it tactile, emotionally responsive, and morally engaged. Humanitarian advocacy therefore represents a major new branch in the overall structure of her life. The gesture of attention became a political and emotional act. From humanitarian advocacy, the story branches first into health awareness, because some of her most influential interventions involved changing how illness and care were publicly understood. Health awareness. Within humanitarian advocacy, health awareness allowed Princess Diana to illuminate neglected realities of illness and comfort people through a mode of public presence that was at once compassionate, symbolic, and disarmingly direct. At a time when certain diseases still provoked fear, shame, or avoidance, she made healthcare settings part of the public moral imagination rather than hidden zones of discomfort. Health awareness refers to the branch of her humanitarian work focused on hospitals, patients, medical vulnerability, and the emotional realities of sickness that often remained obscured behind stigma or institutional language. To illuminate means bringing something into clearer public view, and Diana illuminated not only specific health issues, but also the human loneliness that often accompanies disease. To comfort means easing suffering through tenderness, reassurance, or compassionate presence, and she comforted individuals not abstractly but through touch, eye contact, listening, and bodily nearness. This note follows humanitarian advocacy because health work became one of the most visible and influential forms through which her broader compassion took recognizable shape. In these moments, the princess ceased to be only a ceremonial visitor and became a witness to pain who refused to keep suffering at a safe, symbolic distance. Health awareness mattered because it joined image and ethics. Her presence drew cameras, but what those cameras recorded challenged public fear. From health awareness, the narrative moves into AIDS outreach, since that particular area of her work became one of the most memorable examples of her ability to alter social perception through direct human contact. AIDS outreach. Emerging from the broader medical concern of health awareness, AIDS outreach shows how Princess Diana came to confront public fear and console patients in ways that challenged one of the most emotionally charged stigmas of her era. During years when misinformation, moral panic, and social prejudice surrounded AIDS, even simple gestures of proximity could carry enormous symbolic force. AIDS outreach refers to Diana's visits to hospitals and care settings where she met people living with HIV and AIDS, often in a manner that communicated not abstract sympathy but full recognition of shared humanity. To confront means facing something directly rather than avoiding it, and Diana confronted the fear surrounding AIDS by entering spaces many preferred not to think about and by refusing the bodily distance that stigma encouraged. To console means offering solace to those in pain, grief, or isolation, and she consoled patients through presence, conversation, touch, and the unmistakable message that they had not been abandoned by human dignity. This note follows health awareness because it represents that broader concern at its most morally concentrated. If health work in general allowed Diana to illuminate suffering, AIDS outreach showed her willingness to place herself precisely where society's anxieties were greatest. The image of a princess touching those whom others feared to approach altered public feeling in a way speeches alone could not. Moving upward from AIDS outreach through health awareness to humanitarian advocacy, the narrative then turns into social activism. Because Diana's compassion eventually operated not only in intimate encounters, but also in arenas where public conscience intersected with policy and international pressure. Social activism. Moving upward from the intimate medical setting of AIDS outreach through health awareness to humanitarian advocacy, social activism shows how Princess Diana began to galvanize public conscience and advocate more visibly on issues whose consequences were political as well as humanitarian. Here her work moved beyond bedside compassion into matters where symbolism, visibility, and moral urgency could influence governments, institutions, and international discourse. Social activism refers to the dimension of Diana's public life in which she aligned herself with causes that demanded structural attention, not merely sentimental concern. To galvanize means stirring people into awareness or action with heightened urgency, and Diana galvanized public opinion by attaching her image and credibility to neglected human consequences that could no longer be easily ignored. To advocate means speaking or acting in support of a cause, and she advocated in a way that combined emotional immediacy with public visibility, thereby amplifying issues that might otherwise have remained peripheral. This note follows humanitarian advocacy because activism represented a widened radius of the same compassion. The instinct to comfort the vulnerable expanded into the determination to challenge the conditions that endangered them. Social activism is therefore crucial in showing how Diana's public role developed from empathy into influence. She did not become a conventional politician, but she did become a moral presence whose choices could redirect attention. From social activism, the story moves into landmine eradication because that campaign became one of the clearest examples of her ability to turn symbolic visibility into international urgency. Landmine eradication. Growing directly out of social activism, landmine eradication reveals how Princess Diana could traverse spaces marked by danger and campaign against a hidden weapon whose consequences lingered long after wars had supposedly ended, thereby turning moral visibility into geopolitical force. Her involvement in the issue did not rely on abstract statements alone. It involved physical presence in landscapes scarred by conflict and inhabited by civilians living with permanent risk. Landmine eradication refers to Diana's anti-landmine work, especially the mission that brought her into mine-affected regions and positioned her before the world as both witness and advocate. To traverse means moving through a place, often one that presents difficulty or risk, and her traversal of cleared minefields gave concrete form to the danger that others experienced daily without cameras or protection. To campaign means working publicly and persistently for change, and Diana campaigned by lending the issue emotional urgency, global attention, and symbolic legitimacy that institutions alone had struggled to generate. This node follows social activism because it embodies activism at its most internationally resonant. The campaign demonstrated that her humanitarian identity could operate not only in personal encounters, but in the realm of global policy and public pressure. Landmine eradication mattered because it joined image, courage, and consequence. She did not merely comment on suffering, she placed herself near its terrain. Moving upward from landmine eradication through social activism and humanitarian advocacy to Princess Diana, the narrative then ascends into global iconography. Because by this stage Diana had become more than a royal individual or humanitarian participant, she had become a symbol whose image and meaning circulated far beyond any single role. Global iconography. Moving upward from the moral visibility of landmine eradication through social activism and humanitarian advocacy to Princess Diana, global iconography marks the stage in which Princess Diana came to transcend the boundaries of role and endure as a symbol whose image, emotional force, and cultural meaning outlived the immediate circumstances of her life. At this level, she is no longer understood only as a member of the royal family or even solely as a humanitarian advocate, but as a figure through whom an era's anxieties, hopes, tenderness, and disillusionments were refracted. Global iconography refers to Diana's status as a worldwide cultural symbol, recognizable across nations and generations as an image of elegance, vulnerability, rebellion, and compassion. To transcend means going beyond established limits or categories, and Diana transcended the conventional identity of a princess by becoming something at once more intimate and more mythic. To endure means remaining present and meaningful over time, and her significance endured not simply because of fame, but because people continued to read moral and emotional meaning into her story long after specific events had passed. Global iconography therefore gathers together the public forms of meaning that had been building across earlier nodes. By combining glamour with moral witness, she became legible to multiple audiences at once. From here, the narrative branches first into fashion influence, because clothing, visual presentation, and public image were among the most immediate ways her symbolism circulated and evolved. Fashion influence. Within global iconography, fashion influence shows how Princess Diana learned to signal inner change and innovate public appearance through clothing, posture, and visual self-presentation, making style an active language rather than a decorative afterthought. Her wardrobe was never merely ornamental in the shallow sense often assigned to famous women. It became a medium through which mood, confidence, independence, duty, and reinvention could be communicated before a word was spoken. Fashion influence refers to the impact Diana had on public style and visual culture, as well as the way her clothing choices shaped how people interpreted her evolving identity. To signal means conveying meaning indirectly through signs rather than explicit statements, and Diana used fashion to signal transitions in emotion, role, and self-possession. To innovate means introducing something new or reconfigured, and she innovated within the visual expectations placed on a princess by gradually transforming what royal femininity could look like in public life. This node follows global iconography because iconic status depends heavily on image, repetition, and recognizability, and Diana's image was inseparable from the way she dressed and moved. Fashion influence mattered not because garments were trivial, but because visibility itself was one of her main public instruments. What she wore often told the world how she wished to be seen or refused to disappear. From fashion influence, the narrative narrows into style evolution, where the broader cultural impact of her image is traced through the more personal arc by which that image changed over time. Style evolution. Developing from the public language of fashion influence, style evolution reveals how Princess Diana gradually modernized her appearance and exemplifies a more self-assured identity through visual transformation that mirrored her inner development. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded across years in which innocence gave way to confidence, diffidence to poise, and imposed image to intentional self-presentation. Style evolution refers to the changing character of Diana's clothing, silhouette, bearing, and aesthetic choices across different phases of her life, especially as she moved from youthful reserve into mature authority. To modernize means updating something so that it reflects contemporary sensibility rather than inherited convention, and Diana modernized her public image by loosening the stiffness often expected of royal femininity and embracing cleaner, bolder, more independent forms of elegance. To exemplify means making a quality vividly visible through one's own person, and she came to exemplify confidence, autonomy, and emotional clarity through the way she occupied public space. This node follows fashion influence because influence becomes historically meaningful when it changes and deepens rather than remaining static. Style evolution shows that Diana's image was not an accident of beauty alone, it was a visible narrative of self-redefinition. Viewers could read courage, sorrow, freedom, and renewal in the progression of how she presented herself. Moving upward from style evolution through fashion influence to global iconography, the story then turns into public relatability because Diana's lasting symbolic power did not rest on appearance alone, but on the feeling that ordinary people could somehow recognize themselves within her visible life. Public relatability. Moving upward from style evolution through fashion influence to the broader frame of global iconography, public relatability shows how Princess Diana came to foster emotional closeness and bridge the distance between royalty and ordinary life in ways that made millions feel they knew her not as an abstraction, but as a fellow sufferer and companion in human vulnerability. This quality did not cancel her glamour or status, rather, it existed alongside them, making her unusual among public figures whose privilege often creates distance rather than intimacy. Public relatability refers to the sense that Diana, despite rank and spectacle, remained emotionally legible to ordinary people through gesture, expression, confession, and visible sensitivity. To foster means encouraging something to grow or deepen, and Diana fostered public attachment through repeated acts of warmth, candor, and responsiveness that made audiences feel addressed rather than merely observed. To bridge means connecting separated realms, and she bridged the divide between monarchy and common feeling by allowing sorrow, awkwardness, care, and fragility to appear within her public role. This node follows global iconography because icons endure most powerfully when they are not only admired but felt. Diana's image mattered because it carried emotional access. Public relatability explains why her symbolic status remained so intense. People did not regard her solely from afar, but drew her inward into personal feeling. From public relatability, the narrative moves into vulnerable disclosure. Because the sense of emotional nearness she inspired was strengthened decisively by the moments in which she spoke openly about private suffering rather than preserving a polished silence. Vulnerable disclosure. Emerging directly from public relatability, vulnerable disclosure reveals how Princess Diana chose at key moments to confide aspects of her private suffering and resonate with the emotional experience of millions, thereby making public truth-telling one of the strongest sources of her enduring bond with others. Her appeal did not rest only on kindness witnessed from the outside. It deepened because she allowed aspects of her own pain, loneliness, insecurity, and struggle to become visible in ways that were startling for someone in her position. Vulnerable disclosure refers to the instances in which Diana spoke openly, whether in interviews or broader public narratives, about personal distress that royal convention would once have required her to conceal. To confide means sharing something intimate or difficult with a sense of trust, and Diana confided not in the manner of casual confession, but in a way that made private suffering legible as part of a larger human condition. To resonate means producing a strong emotional echo in others, and her disclosures resonated because they transformed her from object of fascination into subject of feeling. This note follows public relatability because emotional accessibility becomes most powerful when it is reinforced by recognizable truth. Vulnerable disclosure completed the arc by which Diana moved from being watched to being felt. It also helps explain why her legacy remains so vivid. She did not simply symbolize beauty, rank, or tragedy, but something more intimate and unsettling: the visibility of pain within privilege, and the possibility that tenderness might survive it. In that sense, vulnerable disclosure closes the structure by returning us to Princess Diana as a whole, a figure who redefined public womanhood, humanized power, and continues to endure because she allowed humanity, not perfection, to stand at the center of her story. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more English lessons.